Welcome everyone to another CTC software webinar. My name is Sean Zerbis, the Director of BIM Development here at CTC, and today we're going to continue the HIVE CMS User Learning Series, focusing exclusively on user options and what they mean. All of the things that you can control, how you can interact with the actual HIVE CMS itself, and the options that matter to you. So we're going to go over a few things. Now, as always, we have the questions window open on our screen here, so if you have questions about some of what we're talking about today, we encourage you to throw it in there. Now, we do save a huge, QA session at the end, but also I try to answer questions live. Also, as always, this webinar is being recorded, so you can come back to this in the future and be able to kind of review this when you're doing this yourself on your own. Now, if you want to, you can certainly follow along if you have your own version of HIVE CMS installed. I'm going to try to go through all the different options here today, and you can certainly modify yours as they make sense to you. So, what are we covering today? I mean, you've heard me say it a couple of times, options. I mean, options, they're nice. And you've gotten yourself into HIVE, and that's great, but sometimes it's nice to change what you're seeing, and we want to show you today how exactly you can control that, because there's a number of different options that you can use to control or kind of change or improve your experience depending on how you want to interact with HIVE itself. And so I'm going to demonstrate each option in some fairly significant detail so you can control each of these settings, and sometimes you might change them over time depending on what you're trying to do. So I'm going to go over 4 major points here. We're going to talk about controlling specifically preview sizes, and in collaboration with that, how content is presented on screen, because I use the two together, the preview sizes and how I'm showing my content. I might change the preview size depending on what display I'm looking for. And so we're going to talk about both of those. We're also going to take a look at type selection. So when you grab a piece of content specifically for Revit, and in some cases also on the AutoCAD front, when you grab that piece of content, there might be a couple of extra options that pop up. And I want to show you how that works and how you can sometimes even pre-select which types you're working with. And then finally, we're going to take a deep look at the filter and detail panel persistence. We're not going to go in deep on their options. We have other webinars that cover that. But I want to talk about having them opened or not, having them potentially closed, or having them be dynamic for you. So we're going to take a look at that as well. And since I'm not big on death by PowerPoint, we're going to jump in live and show this in the HIVE user interface. First of all, I'm going to focus on the preview sizes. So I have HIVE open here. I'm signed in as Joe, as my demonstration end user here, Joe Demo, and I'm going to run a quick search. We've talked about doing searches before. I could just put something here in the start bar, or I could use a pre-saved search from over here. It doesn't really matter. When you run a search, after you run that, HIVE's going to show you some results. Now, these preview tiles here, the size of these tiles, they're completely up to you. And we're talking about preview sizes here, so you can simply grab this slider right here. In fact, a lot of the controls we'll be using will be right here in this little area of our user interface of the HIVE CMS. This little slider right here lets me make the preview images larger if I want to, or smaller, depending on what my use case happens to be. So you can simply grab that slider and you can change this whenever you want to update these previews however you like to see them. Now, personally, my choice is I like to have these previews just big enough so that the height of the tile itself is as tall as it can be, but it's not super wide, right? If I make it really small, I get all this extra width out there, and I'm just kind of wasting some of that space. I get a number of things on screen, of course, but then the previews are really tiny. So I like to make this just big enough that I get just to the threshold where it starts to make those tiles wider right there, and I stop kind of right there is where I personally prefer this. Now, you may have a different size you like. That's totally fine. In collaboration with the sizes, though, I mentioned, we can also change how that content is presented to you. We've been looking so far at tiles, and that's the default. Over here to the right, you can see a little tile view button. But there's 2 other styles of representing the content itself. Another one that's popular with a lot of users is the list view, and you might prefer this one. What this lets you do is see not just the name of the piece of content, but additionally over here you can see what library it's associated to, potentially the number, or what the tags are that it's associated to. Like right here, I've got a couple of tags associated to this door. I can see if there's any reviews on the content, or how many loads it might have, or downloads, or what category, if this is a Revit piece of content or AutoCAD piece of content, what category the object is, and even what Revit version or AutoCAD version this stuff associates to. So there's a lot of benefits here to seeing some of this extra information live in front of you. Now, for me, this isn't my preferred way because it gives me a lot of content, but it's a big, long list, and I have to scroll a lot more. I personally like seeing the tile view because I see more in front of me in one step. That's my preference, but this is why it's an option. You might like this view a little bit better. And while I'm in this view, I may very well update a little bit of how these tiles are sized. In this case, I make it so that my height of my little rows are no taller than they have to be. Personal preference here, but as I drag to the right, the size of this icon gets just a little bit bigger, and then it starts to expand out vertically, and I don't like that. So I make it just so it's just the right height. It's a little bit smaller than it was in the tile view. Personal preference, that's kind of how I set that up. There's another view that you can use for that content presentation, and that's over here. It's a table view. I don't see a lot of daily Revit users leveraging this style of presentation. This is more of a manager style view, but some companies or some people do like to use this. It's a lot of the same information that is over here on the list view, but presented in sort of a table style format. And this one here, I tend to have my preview icon even smaller because then I get more of the items on screen, and sort of this list view here just kind of gives me more information that I can work with. So it's an option. It's a way of working with this content, right? I'm going to go back to my preferred view, which is my tile view over here, and I'm going to show you another thing that we can do with the content in just a moment. But first, let's talk a little bit about loading content into a project. So I'm going to pin HIVE to the foreground for a minute, because when we get to this next topic here of type selection, I'm going to be loading something into a design environment. And so I have to have that design app open, and I want HIVE to stay in the foreground here. So I'm going to activate Revit over here, and I'm going to go just to, say, a floor plan. And I'm just going to draw a wall out here. So I have something into which I can insert a door. In Revit, doors require walls. So I'm going to go ahead and load a door here. Now, when I grab something like this swing single door, if I just double click on a piece of content and come over here into my design space, what HIVE is going to do is it's going to load up a little type selector. Some of you may not want to see the type selector, and so you can choose to not display this when loading Revit family content. If I uncheck this and I just choose to load all types, it will load all 6, or in this case, I guess 5 types into my active project from this particular family. So it's an option. I, though, tend to be very picky about what it is I load into my active project. So I like loading a specific size or sizes. And when you're doing type selection, you can be picky if you let this box show up. So I always do display the Revit Family Type Selector dialog so that I always get access to my types. Now, I'll show you another way in a minute here how you might do this, but this is how my personal preference is to load these types. I double click on a piece of content. The dialog pops up. If there are types available, I simply choose the one that I want, and I load that into my active model. And in this case, because it came from an earlier version, it's going to do a little quick one-time upgrade. And interesting, it can't place the element. Oh, I know why. Because I'm in a model that doesn't have an actual central model, so it won't let me load something. That's fine. Normally, HIVE would initiate the placement command here. Okay. The other method that we can do this, in fact, let me get into an actual project that will work a little better for me, and I'll come back to this in just a moment. Start a brand new project. This does not have types. So this model here is just going to pop up, in this case, the opening work sets dialog. So no types dialog shows here regardless. Once I'm here, it's a very similar looking model. I'm just going to draw that wall again that I had earlier, and let's go back into HIVE. Regrab my doors, which is what I searched for earlier, and double click on my swing single again so we can load this up. Once again, you'll see the type selector. I can pick a type, and the dialog shows up when it's a Revit family and there's types available. So that's what this does. Now, if I had turned this off, uncheck the always display option, the next time that I grab a piece of content here, like this ICS single door, it also has types. But when I double click on it, because I turned that option off, I don't get presented with any types. It just goes directly to inserting something into my model. And maybe I want to re-enable that. Maybe I'm like, well, I really wish I could see the types and I want to pick it. Let's go take a look at another spot where there's some options, because right here on the ribbon, this little sort of ribbon area where your most of your user options are, it doesn't have that option. That's stuck here inside of your username, inside of user settings right here. And the option is to display the type selector dialog when loading Revit families. This is the checkbox that will turn that option back on. I turned it off when I was loading this door, but I can always come back in here and turn this back on again, so future families, when I drop them, will display that type selector. Okay, I'm going to turn that back on here, just save my option, go back to swing single, double click, and well, this one's probably already loaded, so it's probably just going to do the insert command here instead. If I do a reload, now it will re-pop up with that type selector, and I could choose a different type and bring that into my design environment again after my little one-time upgrade. There we go. All right. So let's take a look at another piece of information here, which is the next slide. Thank you. The filter and the detail panel. Let me pop this to the foreground here. Filter and detail panel. Because these panels, these user options can also give you access. Well, one of them, the details panel, can give you access to that type selection as well. And so that's why I wanted to bring this up as one of my final options to talk about here. And we'll talk about a couple of extra options in just a moment. That wasn't a part of my main sort of script there. So when looking at this content, we talked about the tile view, we had talked about the list view, we had talked about the table view. And the nice thing about the list view is it gives you a little bit of extra detail about your content. And the table view gives you some other details as well. But I had mentioned that I personally prefer to use the tile view. And the reason I do that is because I often will open up the details panel here. So if I was to select on the swing single door, what it will do is it'll actually populate that details panel with some extra information about my door. And this is meaningful because now I can see things like, it told me that there was a review, but now I can actually read the review and when this review was left. Now, in this case, this review is actually no longer relevant. This has been fixed, so I probably should update my review. I'll do that later. That's not really what today's focus is. I can see that there's some attachments here, maybe some detail or some documentation about my door, so I can get access to that through details as well. I can also see the libraries and tags it's associated to, and the category and the Revit versions it's associated to. But down here, this is where the really powerful part comes into play, because in this detail panel, I can now see what the types are, and I can see what all of its parameter values are as well over here. So I can see a lot more information, which I find to be really meaningful. So I can see what the actual parameters and values are. And from here, when I select one of these types, let me pull Revit back to the foreground, I can actually grab one of these and put them directly into my model as well, and it will load that type and start the placement command here in my design environment. So that's another way. If I double click to load this latest version here, if I double click on this particular type, it will then begin to load that into my active environment. So powerful technique there to be able to actually get exactly the type you want, still not need to see that pop-up dialog unless you double click on the family. It will then ask you, but I can still load then from here the types that I desire. Okay. Now I was mentioning also about the filters panel. That's another powerful panel that I use and leave open all the time. So let me show you how to access this. And for now, I'm going to close the details panel intentionally, and I'm going to open up the filters panel. Now the filters panel has a couple of options of how you can display it. When I mouse over the filters here, notice how it's 3 filters that are set. I don't know exactly what they are right now, but when I ran this search, it somehow gave me just the doors, which is interesting and meaningful. And if I run another search like walls, it'll give me just walls here. And in both cases, my search string was everything. So how is it doing that? Well, it's because there are filters that are set. And so this filters panel is actually really important. And the way that this is working right now with the filters panel is as I click on filters, it'll open up, but as I go back to my Hive space, it will disappear. It's a temporary floating panel out there. But what I like to do and what I recommend you do is actually pin it open so it stays open all the time. And then what it'll do is actually reorganize your content over here. And I like to squish my window down so I see kind of 3 columns of content and as many rows as I need. But the reason I do this now and I leave this open 100% of the time is because when you run something like a saved search here, like CTC doors, and it runs a search for everything, you'll know exactly where it's finding those doors and what extra filters are being set. If I search for walls, again, I'll know exactly what's being searched for and how it's filtering. So I really recommend that you leave the filters panel open. Now, we have a webinar that actually goes through in detail how to really leverage this filters panel. I recommend you go check that out. I'm not going to cover that today, but I did want to point out that as an option, you can choose to have the filters panel be floating like this or permanently pinned on screen. And I really would recommend that you pin it on screen and have it open all the time. And that way you always know what filters are at play and why you're seeing the results that you're seeing. All right, a couple of bonus things that I want to talk about here, and that is within Hive, the CMS itself, you'll notice that this is loading for me 25 items, even though it found 40 total items. If I search for something else, like if I go into my mechanical list here, you'll see a significantly different number, 25 items loaded out of a potential 1,500, right? So it's important that you know that there's more content. So right here, it'll tell you how much content it found. And the cool thing is, as you scroll down in this list, it'll just continue to load 25 more. So now there's 50 items out of the potential 1,500. And now it'll go and get 25 more. And it just keeps doing this. But here's the deal. 25 isn't a lot of pieces of content. Most of my searches, the way that I filter, it's usually less than 50 items, and I don't really want to have to wait for the extra, say, 20 or you know, like maybe 10, 15 to load. So let's take a look at this user options here again, so you can control exactly how many items show up in the first result set and every additional result set. Here in the user settings here underneath your username, you can choose the number of items to display per page. I like 50. That's my personal preference. Some people like 100. You can choose anywhere from 10 items all the way up to 100 items. I personally like 50. I like to be right in the middle there. It's a good number because I pay attention then up here to how many items are loaded. And if I found too many, it's usually a good idea to do some additional filtration if it's more than like 300 items, because I don't want to have to scroll through a number of pages. This way, when I go into something like, let's just run that same search again, MEP mechanical here. When I run that search, it looks for everything that's in a specific library. That's any number of Revit categories here, and it finds me 1,500 items. So as I scroll now, whether I grab the bar and scroll down, or whether I use my wheel and I scroll down, it's going to load 50 additional items to this list, and you'll see this go from 50 items loaded to 100 items loaded. And then I have a bunch more. Now at this point, again, if I see 100 items and I still haven't found what I'm looking for, it's probably a good idea to leverage the filters panel. This is why I recommend that you have the filters panel always open. So that way, you can control how many items are loaded per page and how much you have to scroll before it starts to cache and load a few more things. One final thing I want to point out here. Let's go do a search here for some details. Sometimes I can see enough from the preview icon. Sometimes I can't. Sometimes it's just not enough detail. And so instead of making my previews super massive and maybe being able to see what I want and maybe not being able to see what I want, what I like to do is go into my user settings again, and I'll turn on the enlarge preview on mouse hover. And you can choose how much additional size you get on top of this with this little slider right here. Personally, I always just max it out. But when you do that, if I save this, when I'm out here looking at something like a detail and I mouse over this guy, I can actually see quite a bit more. In fact, maybe you can't read this, but on my screen, I can actually read this. And I can see that there's things like, yeah, there's a turbulator and there's stainless steel couplings and there's things inside of it. I can go, oh yeah, this is the detail that I want. And I can see that before I even load it directly into my project. So this gives me a real easy ability. Now, some of these are still going to be super huge, and I won't be able to read it anyway. But at least it gives me a really good idea of what's going to be in that particular detail prior to double-clicking and prior to loading it in. All right. Now, I have seen questions in the past about, can I control how long that preview hover over stays on screen? And the answer is no, there isn't a time controller for that today. When I mouse over it, it pops up, it lasts for approximately 10 seconds, and then it will disappear so that it doesn't have to stay out there. I find that to be meaningful because to me, it's kind of annoying that it, when hovered over previews stay on screen full time. Some people don't like that and they wish that they could just keep it out there. I would say, shoot CTC some feedback. Let us know that, hey, I wish this would do this. In fact, there's a little area right here where you can actually give us feedback about the product itself. If you have some suggestions or some wishes or whatnot, go ahead and leverage this and let us know, like, hey, it'd be really cool if there was a time control on that, or I wish it would last just a little bit longer. So you can actually let us know that as well by using this option right here of the feedback function. All right. I think I've covered all of the major options that I intended to today. So for those of you who don't like to hang out for the Q&A session that kind of happens after the main presentation, I want to say thank you. And we hope to see you in future CTC webinars. You can always, of course, find out about these webinars from our events page on our CTC website. You can also go to our YouTube channel, subscribe there, because that'll let you know when we upload any of our recordings from our webinars. And we hope that you find some good reuse value in those. But for now, for those of you who are going to hang out for the Q&A session, if you have questions, start queuing them up, because we're going to jump into questions here. I want to make sure that if you do have specific questions about these user options and how this functions inside the HIVE CMS, that you can get those questions answered. All right. I do see a question that just popped in here that I want to make sure that I answer. There was a question about, what does the asterisk mean in the search text box? Now, I'm going to give you a really generic answer first, but then I'm going to give you a slightly more detailed answer because, here in the Q&A section, that's the whole purpose, is to help you understand more about this. Now, my generic answer is, we've talked in great detail about how to refine your searches, how to leverage your filters to really get what you're looking for. So I would recommend you go to our YouTube channel and take a look at that searches video to get all your questions answered out about the searches. But in short, right here today, this asterisk basically means search for everything. This is kind of the universal character for everything. In Windows, if you go to your little search bar in the top right of Windows Explorer, you put an asterisk, it finds everything. That's kind of what the asterisk means. Here, it means find everything. And it means find everything, but I leverage my filters in collaboration with that, because if I cleared my filters out and just said find everything, it's going to find me 15,626 pieces of content, which isn't very meaningful. And so I leverage this in collaboration with my libraries. Now, this asterisk is saved within my saved searches, a lot of my saved searches. So the MEP details says find everything that's in this library that's a Revit view. Or if I go to my CTC doors search, find everything that's in this library that's Revit content and that's doors. And this helps me to filter down. You can also just leverage this search bar for something very specific, like find me single stuff that's in this library, that's Revit content, that's doors. I started out a little generic. So when I use just the basic search term here of CTC doors, this tells me that I'm looking at my corporate library for a particular category of object. And these types of searches like doors and walls, I would expect this to be everything that's within there that matches that criteria. Now, there's other times when I don't do that, when I do something like CTC walls interior, where I kind of include what my search term is. I actually abbreviated it to int here, but it's running the search term of int. It's looking at the library of my library, just for Revit content that's walls, but now it's finding me stuff that matches int versus the other one here in my save search for walls, where it looked for everything. That's what the asterisk means, is everything that's in one of these libraries. So that's what the asterisk actually means is it's a common search term for all things, unfiltered basically. Don't look at what the search term is, just find me everything and then filter based on its properties over here. All right. All right. I haven't seen any other questions roll into the questions window, so I think it's probably time for us to shut it down today. So with that, once again, I want to say thank you to all of you who have stayed here for the Q&A session. We hope that it's more meaningful for you when you show up live and can actually ask questions. So we're going to go ahead and shut it down. Oh, you know what? Hang on a second here. There is another question that just popped in. There was a question that says, is there a way to export the preview images that are used in HIVE to actually use as display images in the families themselves, maybe on your network? And the answer to that is technically no, but you don't need to. You don't need to. So what you can do in Revit specifically, I'm assuming that you have some level of BIM management experience here. CTC software actually offers some tools on our BIM manager suite, and one of them is actually a free tool, has no cost to you, but it's called the Family Preview Manager. This actually lets you open up your families automatically. You can give it a whole list of families. It'll open them. It'll generate a preview for those families based on rules, based on the exact same rules you can leverage in HIVE for its previews, and then save those previews to the family itself. So the Family Preview Manager is a tool you may want to take a look at for families on your local network. Just set your rules up for this to match exactly the same rules that you would use in the HIVE CMS when you're processing content. Now, today's session is from an end user's point of view, how do you search for and find content? So I don't have the controls on this user account to actually process content to show you what some of those settings are, but the Family Preview Manager is certainly a tool you can use, so you don't have to save the preview images out of HIVE and then try to apply them to the family, because we've got tools to automate that for you directly from the Revit session. So that might answer that question for you. All right. One final thank you to everybody. We really do appreciate when we get a chance to interact with you. It keeps it more interesting for us. We hope it keeps it more interesting for you as well. And we hope to see you in future CTC webinars, both for the continuation of this CTC HIVE user learning series, but also a number of our other presentations that we do throughout the weeks as well. With that, have a fantastic day, and we hope to see you all in the next one.